Welcome to DLE Love Notes, the Roundtable. I'm joined here by Pastor Gabby and Pastor Andrew for a fruitful conversation about love. All-encompassing, no holds bars. We want to go deep into different areas and spectrums of love, not just from a God's perspective, not from a marital perspective, not even just from a personal perspective, but how do we view it in its entirety? Why is it important to us, etc. So with that, I will then turn to the creators of DLE Love Notes, Pastor Gabby, Pastor Andrew.
Hey family, thank you for joining us. We have some of our dear friends gathered. All of them are amazing. And we're just going to have a free-flowing conversation. So we have Yolande Morris from Wit and Grace magazine. We have married couple extraordinaire. Is extraordinaire too much? Was that too much? I feel like y'all are extraordinaire, but that was a lot. Okay, how about this? NCANT's finest. Is that better? Okay, Brittany and Leroy.
Also true.
Right, also true. We have a dope moderator, Keenan Williams, right here, and then we've got the creator and founder of the new This Is Well collective for Black women, Elise Galloway. So we're just gonna have a great time and a great conversation. So thanks for tuning in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Pastor, I'm gonna float to the left here. Please, everybody, engage as you see fit. But let me just kick off with a general question and just dive deep.
Is that you telling me I'm going first?
Yeah, you can go first. Okay. Because I was going to tap you on the table, but I felt the eye contact was there. But how do you know individually when you're being loved well?
Ooh, just walk into the deep end. I think you know when you're being loved well when. So of course, there are a lot of experiences with love, but certainly in a general sense, I'd say when you can be yourself, when you don't have to manufacture a mood when you don't feel it, talk a certain way when you don't have, you don't want to deploy a certain kind of code switching, but you can just kind of show up as you are. I think that not all there is to love, but I think that's an essential component.
Got it. So self-truth, being genuine. How else you guys feel about that?
I think you know you're being loved well when you have peace. When you feel at peace at home or wherever you are, like when you feel that stillness, comfort. For me, it's like I know I'm being loved well.
But give me a little bit more about that comfort. Like, what is that? Is that stillness? Is that I am able to rest without issue? Is that I can have silence and be happy with that?
I think it's comfort? I think comfort is like to the individual, right? Like what makes you comfortable. But I think for me, it's like it's peace, it's feeling protected, it is stillness. I think it's a few things, but it's like knowing like this is home.
Got it. Okay. In general, folks, engage with me about the feeling of that peace. We've all felt it in different regards, in different scenarios, with different people. But what does peace feel like? Give me some descriptors.
I think a part of it's when you don't have to censor yourself. When you don't have to censor yourself and say, oh, if I do this person's going to think I'm this, that, and the third. But just peace comes with just being able to just be, I think. And when people love you well, you can be and not have to moderate or modulate down your actual personality or your actual thoughts or how you're feeling in the moment.
Also, like the understanding of it as well too, because we're not going to be, our perfect selves all the times, but your partner understanding, that's not, or at least being willing to, ask that question, like that couldn't have been what it was. Let me check a little bit more. It's like that's the piece, is that knowing that each thing you do or each mistake you make won't be the end all be all, because we can talk about it later. So,
right.
I understand that.
Elise?
No, so I was just going to add a nuance to, and I think a lot of the conversation that we've had has been around peace or love or feeling loved with a partner, which is super valuable and obviously really important, but I think there is a level of love that you can accomplish just with yourself, right? And a piece that is almost not more important, but just as valuable. It's like if you don't have that self-love, if you don't have that self-peace, what do you have? And you can't allow somebody else to fulfill that for you. So I think definitely valuing being loved by a partner, but also seeking that and attaining that love of yourself and making sure that's a priority as well.
And I would just even say that I think that you can, in situations, be loved well, but have no peace because you're not able to even tap into that self-love because you don't know like what it is to really love yourself. So then when other people love you, you're like, what is this? Oh my God, like, are they for real? What's going on here? And so to your point, I think that being loved well has to start first within you, and then it flows out, because then you're able to not only love yourself well, you're able to love others well, and then receive their love whether or not they give it, right? So because you're like, I have this love inside of me, so even if you withhold it, I still have peace, I still have joy, I still have contentment, because it's not dependent on someone else.
Right.
That's important. It's definitely important in marriage. You have to have your own peace, your own sense of self-love before you can reciprocate and give it to anyone else.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting too, because the church often talks about, with high levels of specificity, how to be in a relationship, how to move toward marriage, how to then maximize and be benevolent within your marriage. That blossoming of a flower to the point of the table starts with the individual. Can we talk a little bit about how, as individuals, we show and express love to ourselves? Is it a self-care routine, right? The Bible doesn't necessarily talk about self-care routines, right? However, we know...
Washing at the feet!
Listen, potentially, on a one-off basis.
I like it.
But we all know within faith, within our practice, within our spiritual routines, from an individual perspective, that self-time is important. So how are we showing ourselves that self-love as individuals first?
I think a part of it too, to go back to what Elise was saying, is getting to know yourself and being okay with that. So I've had seasons of my life where like I wanted to project a particular persona, and so I was even like lying to myself that persona was who I actually was.
Right. Yep.
And once I realized that like who I wanted to be and who I actually were different, I had to start learning how to love who I actually was, right? And it starts off as in a really like low place, because you know you kind of feel like I can live into whatever I want to be. Like I want to be extrovert, I'm gonna be extrovert. If I want to be a boss, I'm gonna be a boss. And then like when you start to realize like, wait, I actually don't thrive well in certain settings that I want to thrive well in, but I don't, so knowing myself knows I can do this in dosages. And then that may mean that certain people who might have like rocked with me when I was acting like I could thrive well in those spaces now want nothing to do with me because I'm noticing that what I was doing was a performance and it wasn't actually me. Right. So I think a part of that like loving yourself is like also like giving yourself space to know that like there might be parts of you that are you. And here's the crazy thing, the people that actually see that and love that part of you, we usually reject. Because we're like, no, that's not me.
No, you can't love that about me. That's not all
that's not
me.
who I want to be. Like that's not the version of me I want to be. And
Right.
the people who actually love us, like they see that and they love us regardless. And sometimes we push them away because they're kind of a mirror that we don't want to hold up to ourselves.
And I think when you're speaking of self-love, you get to a point where you have to realize that we become one, especially like the marriage thing. So taking care of your partner is taking care of yourself, because if they're not happy, then you're not happy. So it almost becomes your joy to make the other person happy so that you can be happy, because I can't be happy unless she's happy. So
Fair, but it's interesting because your wife had the other side of the
I was gonna
dynamic
say,
as
I
an
have the
individual.
other, and it's weird to be in a marriage where we usually have different perspectives.
That's healthy.
I think for me, I feel like knowing me, like he benefits by the better I know myself,
Yes.
he will benefit.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time. I'm very introspective, so I spend a lot of time figuring out why I react certain ways, why I do certain things, why I feel certain ways. I think for me, loving myself has been being honest about who I am, whether that be good or bad, right? Being honest in my friendships, being honest with my husband about who I am, and if that requires me to reintroduce myself, then I reintroduce
Critical.
myself.
Wow.
Critical.
Allow me to reintroduce myself.
Because it's like, I need to be honest about who I am, and I think the biggest thing as an adult has been learning to articulate who I am,
Yes.
and so that I don't offend you because I didn't tell you, right? You know, like
While being the same in every room, right? That intention doesn't change.
that's the goal, is to be the same at home and at work, and I've had to learn how to articulate who I am to my husband and to my manager, right? This is who I am, this is how I work. Clarity's kind. You know, this is who I am. But I think I had to have an understanding of who I was, and then I could come to the table and say, hey, I would love to be your friend, your partner, your sister. This is something you should know about me. What should I know about you? You know, that's kind of how I've been working as an adult, or trying to learn to work as an adult.
And you know, you talked about with the Bible, I think that, you know, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
And so we can't essentially love other people until we love ourselves. And
Absolutely.
so for me, for a long time, I thought self-care and self-love is like, okay, going for a spa treatment and bubble baths, like all the like, pampering
right.
and all that. But that's on the surface.
Right.
But it had to go deeper in terms of, okay, I'm a perfectionist. I have to give myself grace. I have to give myself space to like make mistakes and to mess up and to be content in where I am in life. And that's self-love to me. So once I'm able to do that for myself, it's easy for me to then give that to other people. I'm like, oh, you messed up. Now I'm not like, oh my God, I would never mess up. What are you doing? You know? And then been like that in relationships where it's like, how could you do that? How could you mess up? Because I didn't have that grace or that self-love to give myself when I messed up, so I'm never going to give it to you.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think for me, it has to, and Jesus said you can't love your neighbor until you love yourself.
So it's interesting. The self-love piece comes in stages.
Yeah.
It definitely has an evolution period when it comes to being the same way inside and outside, and I think inside and outside the home. I think another important question is, we're all in our 30s, approaching our 40s. Talk me through.
Sorry, I just had to.
That's all right. No, that's wisdom. That's wisdom. That's wisdom.
I got some time. I'm 52.
Wisdom.
Okay, I'm 52.
We all look healthy and our souls are glowing.
But you're right.
But the question is, our souls are glowing. Can we talk about, with full transparency, the transitions we went through? Let's start with college. I was at HBCU alumni. Self-love was absent, right? There wasn't even an understanding of how to do so. It was always a following of, trying to get down with, trying to perform for,
True.
right?
True.
In my 20s, post-college, I then only moved to New York with that same thought process. So then it became emulating those at work and those who were the mentors and everyone else in space. I'm now in my 30s understanding how to love myself. So I can say today, I'm learning how to do it well. I'm not there yet. I have inflection points, it ebbs and flows. But from a wellness perspective and in general, can we talk about, do we honestly think we love ourselves well? And if the answer is no, or inconsistently, what are we doing to love ourselves well? Like, what is the actual practice we put in?
Ooh.
Well, you said my trigger word, wellness, right? And I think when I think of wellness, it's a journey. It's something that is constantly developing. It's not stagnant. So paralleling that to self-love, it evolves. It's a journey, and I can confidently say, have I gotten better? Yes. Am I where I want to be? No. You know, and I think so many things inform how you love yourself, whether it's past relationships, whether it's seeing who's modeled relationships before you, perception of self, you know. I think hopefully as you get older, you have further clarity into yourself. You kind of date yourself almost, which I think is so important, to just date yourself. It's like, ask yourself, like, Elise, what are you?
Yourself first.
But it's like, what are you up to today? You know, like what's bothering you? What's something that brings you joy? Like, get to know yourself and everything. And as you get to know yourself, I think you can hopefully learn to love yourself. But I'm definitely not at the point where I fully am like, oh my gosh, Elise, you're the best thing that ever happened to me.
And it's okay for that to be the goal.
But like, I don't think that's my goal. But like, I think it's slowly but surely happening. And I'm proud of the progress that I've made thus far. And I think where I'm at now in terms of self-love, I'm better able to love people around me because of it, which is just an amazing blessing. But not there yet.
From the men at the table, I'm really interested in hearing this perspective from an evolution standpoint.
Go ahead and invite us into conversation.
Well,
I appreciate it.
Well, I mean, look, you, from the perspective of singleness, marriage, and then the responsibilities of building community, walk me through what that looks like to understand when you were and were not loving yourself well, and what that impact was.
Ooh. Oh, have mercy.
Take your time.
I think I appreciate the way you set up the question. I think a part of the stakes and what has hung in the balance for me with respect to self-love is separating out how to navigate a system that often assigns value and significance based on how you perform. Right? If you perform well, you get this kind of salary. If you perform well, you get invited to speak here or preach here or do this. So for me, I think going through the 20s was a process of recognizing that, you do want to do the best you can, right? You want to have some kind of self-efficacy. But psychologists make the point that it's important to separate self-efficacy from self-esteem. That who I am is not tied to my position
Or title.
and production and in that capitalist system. So I think it's important to navigate it, but to separate. So for me, I think a part of that journey over time has been not just making that separation, but trying to be gentle and rigorous about accepting who I am at this point in life. And then being a meticulous celebrant of myself, celebrating who I am, what I've done, and being unembarrassed about my celebration. Doesn't have to be compared to somebody else. But this is worth savoring for me. At this stage in my mindful masculinity, trying to be a spirit-led person. So that's what I said.
Well, it's funny because that was the point when Elise said, the example you said was, I don't need to say in the mirror, like, I'm the best ever. But in some regards, particularly for men, I think we do have to say that. Because when you do separate efficacy versus esteem, you take money made out the equation, position in the home out the equation, the way my wife views me out the equation, and you stand as an individual man. That has had trials and tribulations throughout. I know from 15 to 35 for the three of us. I unequivocally.
And I think when we give ourselves permission to stop following, like, we've been on the same path to becoming a man since probably like 7 or 8. When a group of guys shows up and we just fall in line, there's no conversation. He's the leader. I tell the jokes. I'm the person that goes against this. There's no conversation with men. It's just like when we show up, which one of us
who has the role.
Who that dude is, and the rest of us are a part of the team. And because of team sports, team this, team that, if I play my role, we're all going to be good. But when you give yourself, I think, the opportunity to step outside of that, and you're okay being like, hey, I'm going to be myself, and this is just what we're doing, and I work on it. It's not their fault. It's just like, okay, I'm building me right now. So that becomes when you start becoming the man, because you gave yourself permission to stop following. I don't have to find a role in here. I'm just going to I'm going to play all the parts in my own movie.
Are you doing that well at this point? But back to the original question.
That's a hard thing, because it's like, how do you judge? There's no like scale for it. Like, you could feel great and be like, a drain on society. So it's like, you have to go with what you put out into the world, and what people are telling you. The feedback is the most important part of it.
Is it? Is that indoctrination? Because if we're being a self-celebrant, that has to be that's an individual.
Well, you got to celebrate where you are, because you still have, every day that you're alive walking, you have a chance to get better. But if you're going off the fact that you're here for a reason, and you have the goal of being the best, or the goal of being better, or the goal of what my family needs, then the fact that you even know in the first place that you have to get better is the thing to celebrate. But how do you know you're there, or you've made a few steps, or like, you have to go off of the thing that you put out in the world? How's it received? That's the art of it. You can't be an artist without the feedback.
That's interesting. Interesting.
I think also too, one's ability to self-narrate. So I like how you all are walking through like childhood, adolescence, 20s, 30s, and I think for me, I have I have realized that I've learned to love myself better than when I was in my 20s because I can tell more honest stories about my 20s. So I can tell more honest stories about what Hampton actually was for me.
Right.
And what I actually, the crowds I actually fell into that like I'm ashamed I fell into.
Pastor hat off.
Yeah, that like literally, honestly, we're gonna go into a place of vulnerability. Pastor hat on. So I fell into a super Christian group of people maybe 2 weeks into school.
Wow.
And I mean, so intense, like almost like cult-like. To the point where when I opened my eyes and left the church, the pastor told me everything that was supposed to happen in my life positively would no longer happen because I disassociated with them. And then that was my like, okay, ding, ding, ding. I made the right decision to leave. But as a result, HBCU culture is very much predicated on how you show up your freshman year. Right?
It does.
How you enter.
How
you enter is how you exit, right? It ain't.
Everybody breathe.
People don't forget.
Right. So
we don't worry about people anymore.
Exactly.
Y'all not gonna drag HBCUs though.
No, I love my HBCU veteran. I love my HBCU.
I'm a ride out there.
Yes, I love it. But to the point of this question, right? When I lived into a different version of myself in my 20s,
right,
there was a temptation to narrate Hampton differently.
Of course.
Because people assume that if you went to an HBCU, you knew yourself well, you partied all the time, you had a really great social group. Like there are all these like assumptions.
Amongst your people, so you have to be.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And a lot of my friends who I have now who went to my school, I met as an adult, as an alum, like meeting them in New York, like, oh, you went to Hampton, you went to, and so those are not like I have very few long-standing friendships from college because of the journey I fell into and how I had to kind of narrate myself out. And self-love in my 30s allows me to tell that story and not feel like people are going to think that like I'm weird because I had a weird college experience. And it allows me to more so be like, I'm going to tell it because I told my nephew's at Hampton right now, and I told him before he went in, I was like, listen, don't even go to church your first year. This is the pastor speaking. I was like, if you roll out of bed and go to chapel, cool. But I didn't want him to have the experience I had. So I was like, just if I had waited, I would have been able to better assess what kind of energy they were bringing. So to your question about, are we loving ourselves well? I think the ability to narrate the parts of ourselves that probably bring us the most shame, and being able to that made me a better version of myself because that was such a low place that when I got out of it, I was like, I'm not going back there.
Right.
And it changed how I showed up in space, and it meant that when somebody told me they were a Christian, I was like, what kind? What do you mean by that?
That's a real question. And you were about to jump in earlier.
I was about to just, because you said something about men and teams and following, and I just tacked onto that because I feel like one of the number one things that I hear from married women or my single friends is that they have trouble with men leading. And it's not that they want to lead, it's like they're always like, why won't he lead me? And so, it's just interesting that I've never heard it put that way in terms of just like a man comes along and, you fall in line based on whatever narrative it is that you learn growing up. So I just thought that was interesting because we're just always like, why can't he lead? Why, we just, and maybe it's a church thing or or societal thing, but there just seems to be, where women are now like boss women, boss all of this, and then we're struggling, I think, sometimes to find a man that's going to take charge or, that kind of Christian leader in the house role that we've been indoctrinated to believe, has to happen.
Unfairly told
that
every man wants to lead. And I've been church retreats and trying to do the proper marriage thing, and one thing that I get upset about,
proper defined by societal norms,
but defined by societal religious norms, defined by Baptist norms, but the idea that every man is prepared, equipped, and volunteering to lead is not true. And it's for the reason that did you marry the captain of the team, or did you marry the alternate? You know what I mean? Like you have to. You don't think about it. You don't think about it that way.
That settled in for a second.
My mind.
But in terms of like,
you're right though. You're right. You make a good point.
That's a phenomenal point.
In
Phenomenal
terms
point.
of the team, no one's telling you that when you're young,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
as a daughter who admired and loved my father, whom was a leader, who was a very hyper masculine
Mm-hmm.
man, but also very endearing. I'm one of 4 girls, right? So he had no choice. But
He had only girls?
Only girls. But you're told that men innately want to lead. And I've asked our pastor, like, why do you keep saying that? Why don't you take the opportunity to teach young men how to lead?
Right.
Because it's not innate. There are some people that are innate leaders. They're innate captains. They're innate president of
Yes.
whatever. They're innately that. And you see that in life, right?
That's not the majority.
That's not the majority.
Right.
I was always in a place of leadership. I was never president. Right? I was always growing up. When we talk about like childhood, I look back at my childhood. I was always in leadership roles. Right? I was never president though. So,
There.
but I'm on the board.
Because there's a difference between title and role.
And role.
Yeah.
I'm always in leadership. I'm always an advocate. When I think back to me being a child, I was extremely shy, but I was always an advocate, right? I may be shy, but if someone's bullying you, like,
Right.
now I feel empowered. Now
Come on.
I have to do something,
Come on,
right?
sis.
But that's not everyone's innate
Yeah.
thing.
Absolutely.
And I
True.
think when you talk about, it took me forever to figure out what equally yoked meant. And I was like, what does this mean?
Let's talk about that. Go ahead. Let's throw it out there.
I was like, what does that mean? And I think when you are a leader, in terms of like people following in line, people do. In rooms, you see it. In rooms of men and women.
Yeah.
You get into a room and you see whose personality is going to be larger and whose personality is going to be funny and who's going to be whatever. And I think that's going to be a human thing. But you're told as a woman that no, all men lead. So if I'm a leader, if that's my thing, then innately he must be. Like they all must be. And it's
Which ties
really,
into the roles piece.
it's a false narrative.
Huge.
It's a
Huge.
false
And it
narrative.
causes a lot of harm in relationships when someone then hears that and they go into their relationship and try to put that on.
Yep.
Again, like trying to put on
The
what you want to be perceived as versus what you actually are, right? No, go ahead.
And also, like, there's the negative side of it, because we also have the hyper masculine man that's not leading, that is upset that his wife or counterpart is making more money or is in the better position. Like, I teach at a school. I teach Spanish for a high school, and all the time I tell you, my wife works at Google. She makes double of what I make. I tell.
That's all right. First and foremost, we will celebrate that. We will celebrate your success.
But there's young men in front of me, and I was like, she makes double, and they were like, and there's innately that look like,
Are you okay with it?
you're good?
Yeah.
Because they see me as like, the leader of this classroom, the leader here, the leader there. And it's like, I might not have it all together, but the stuff you need, I've been here twice. It's like, I'm old enough to be here twice. So I think throwing that piece out there that, these girls can be your counterpart is the thing that may fix where I fall short. Like, I'll do it for the next generation.
And the important thing to know on this point of leadership is that leadership is something that's distributed, right? It's important to know, I think, in Black History Month that Ella Baker, for instance, right, tried to get us to see that leadership is something that is exercised by multiple people versus like a singular sort of thing. And so in healthy relationships, somebody is good with finances, somebody's good with communication, somebody's good with
Logistics.
negotiating bills, whatever the case may be.
Play your role.
Yeah, and so having that choreography and having the kind of synchronized approach to leadership, I think is helpful not only in romantic love, I think it's helpful in thinking through love of our people so that we can do what needs to get done and have an effective division of labor versus looking for what Tamara Lomax might call Black Moses to step in and save us all.
And we don't want anyone in the relationship to feel like they have to shrink or to be smaller than based on the role that I have as I'm the leader. So it's like, I do this. Well, I mean, if you're doing it, like, you're obviously doing it. So
That shrink piece is critical. That
like,
actually,
you don't want people to feel like they have to shrink.
however, is it controllable? Oftentimes, it isn't. Mostly from the man's perspective.
Is the shrink is what controls
What is the shrinking inward controllable? Oftentimes, if you have a classroom full of young Black men who immediately hear your wife makes double, and their expectation is to lean in and say, "You're okay with that?" You are looking at an entire class representing an entire next generation, still being taught that same false narrative, right? So the question I actually want to ask kind of is twofold. Pulling from that perspective, walk me through what's the best and worst love advice you ever got. And secondly, knowing that we still have generations after generations learning false narratives, walk me through the trauma you had to overcome such that you can then elaborate and grow and be in a synchronized position with love. I.e., I grew up with all individual single women, which means I battled with infidelity from teenage years. I didn't know how not to cheat on a girlfriend. How not to cheat on a girlfriend, i.e., always doing it, because I was taught by the men who weren't leaders in my household, who weren't husbands in my household, who weren't consistent in my household, that the more women you had in your circle, the stronger you are. Right? My little sister was told you only date one boy at a time. I was glorified for having, I'm gonna leave it at that. But
that was a whole lot of taps, brother. That was a tap for every borough.
I didn't assume a tap for every borough. I was like, are we at the lunch table making beats? I was talking about music.
You're right, pick it up. But
I picked it up. I picked it up right. You're right. You're right.
So for instance, that's inherent trauma that was celebrated. So I didn't learn how to solve that until therapy in my 30s.
Right.
I had inherent trauma on the other side.
What did it look like?
So I was raised by a single mother, and so I was raised to protect my heart. And I wasn't raised not to trust men, but I was raised not to trust them too quickly.
Okay.
And then we started dating at 19.
Right.
We got serious quickly. We didn't get married until we were 24, 25, but we got serious quickly. And my family liked him, but were very suspicious of me locking in with the man that early on, that exclusively, from a different perspective, not from a male perspective of like sow your oats, but from a woman's perspective of like, are you sure that like this guy actually, is the one you want to give all this time and attention to?
Was that good advice or bad advice?
It was good and bad.
Pivot to the question.
It was good and bad.
Okay.
It was good because it kept my eyes open and I was able to see, his true character, and I was like, yeah. But it was bad because it's a suspicion that then, connected to a little bit of like shame that we locked in so early and that we were so sure that it was just us. And I remember when I was in grad school, before we got engaged, and I was sitting on the porch with my mother and my sister in Texas, and they were like, don't give any man your 20s. We're all good now, but so that's the advice. Right?
That's funny, but what lens do you think your mom was even coming from?
So this is what I'm going to say. That was good advice.
Okay.
Because what they were saying was, okay, he's passed the test of like being, good and real and sure. And also, like, how long y'all gonna do this before another step comes in,
Right.
And their point was, the advice was good, because their point was, listen, if y'all aren't about to go for the long haul, right? Like, first of all, we didn't really want you to lock in early, but since you did, if this isn't going to be the person that you marry,
don't just stick around.
How much of your 20s will you give to someone? Because when you wake up at 29 or 30 and y'all have broken up and you're starting over, you just lost a decade of where most people are figuring out who they want based on how they date.
Exploring.
Right. So it was good advice, and it was useful advice. And then, like, very soon after, he ended up proposing. So I was like, "Ooh, okay, I made it." But but it was really tough.
After the fact.
But it was tough.
Well, listen, it has to be tough. And it's funny because hearing your mom and your sister, and let's be candid, per the question, have you gotten good and bad advice? Often we have to think in retrospect, what was the lens that they were wearing when they told me that, right? So for instance, I can't be mad at my uncles who supported dating multiple women because the lens they came from was so much hurt by a one-off relationship that the only way they had a coping mechanism to move forward was to have multiple women, multiple children, and that was just accepted. Now in my 30s, I'm realizing how crazy toxic that was, how much of my spirit I've given away, how much rebuilding of self I have to do because of those years playing that game, however that game was celebrated. Now, in my 30s, and maybe you can opine on this, the circle gets even smaller when you want to talk about those traumas and those vulnerabilities and those truths. The circle gets even smaller of women when the labels are immediate or the narrative is quick and sticks, right? It's not just college.
When the narrative is what?
Quick and sticks.
What does that mean?
So the narrative about somebody, the reputation, is quick to be defined and then sticks with you no matter what.
Oh.
Right? Right? And so in general, that actually makes men shrink even more. Right? Therapy helped me actually come out of that shrinking to know that agnostic to what the market may say or who I've affected, I can still move forward with. until I had that narrative of self, the positive advice of love didn't start to flow. So i.e., had I not done that self-work, I would still be receiving into my 40s and 50s that negative work. So my question to the table is not just what was the good or bad love advice, but what did you have to do personally to adjust to that advice if you followed it?
So, you know, like Gabby, I grew up in a single parent household. My mom was the provider. You know, my mom went to, you know, all throughout my childhood, I saw her always going to school, going back to school. She was an immigrant, buying a house, like constantly providing. And so I took on that role of I'm going to get a good job, I'm going to make money, get multiple degrees. And I remember being in church and being told that, you know, guys are intimidated by me because I have so much, or I just have myself, I seem like I have it all together. And you talk about the shrink, so then what that does for me is then I start to shrink because I'm like, to be loved,
I must reduce.
I must be, and it's, you know, it is a Christian, so, you know, you have to be lesser so that he can be greater, and it's a Christ-like thing that we apply to even like husbands and men in our lives, and it's like, no, like I only shrink for Christ, not for anyone else.
And even I want to put a pin in that, because you don't actually have to shrink, because God is actually big enough for you to be your full self, and God is still bigger.
Abundance.
But we tell a really horrible narrative that people have to shrink for this God to be in relationship with them, which is why I love, like, Scripture affirms Christ before he does anything. It's like, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased, before he performs any miracle, before he does anything. But keep going.
Amen. So all of that. So then, you know, I had to also therapy to get to a place where
It's not a bad word.
It's not a bad word. It's a great thing to get to a place where I'm worthy of love, and who I am and what I bring to the table is valuable, right? I don't have to shrink to attain value. I don't have to be more than I am to attain value. Who I am in this moment is enough. And what I offer, you know, is enough. So if a guy out there sees all this goodness, then he's got, exactly, amen. He's got to come, but also he doesn't have to shrink either, right?
Yeah.
So we come together, and I think it's a building up of each other. That's the kind of marriage I want. That's the kind of relationship I want, where we're building each other up. Yeah, we see the flaws. Yeah, we see where, you know, it could be a little bit better, but we're in this together, and we're helping each other. But again, we don't have to shrink to be loved.
It's almost like the new definition of equally yoked.
Yeah.
Right? Where, funny, just you saying that kind of triggered me, because I remember as a son of a pastor, with all my background, I used to question my dad so intensely about these norms preached, expectations had, but there's no support of the actual inner work. Right? Like we lay the template. We tell you how to cut the grass, how to make it look good. The optics are present, but in the darkest of times, it's always just go to God. That's not the answer. And it sounds like Double Love is a church built around giving way more intentional context around
Trying to.
These old norms that we're not going to call the church toxic. We're going to call the church built by the time period it was built in. It just had a legacy effect where it just didn't change. It feels like the adoption that you two are bringing to the world is one in which I'm going to give you the full level set of education to help you build in totality, not in just pieces, not in just you're the man, go lead, you're the woman, go be beautiful, you make the house work, you make the kids work, you make like in general. When you then think about it in that way, what is most important when it comes to defining love with a partner?
Defining love with a partner.
Yep.
I think it goes back to all the things we talked about, though, right? Like defining what self-love means to you, how you want to be loved. Just being aware of all those things before you understand that, like, I want a partner. You have to understand there's a responsibility that comes with having a partner. The responsibility. Are you prepared to answer that responsibility, that call, right? Do you understand what it means to be loved for yourself? Can you sit down with another person and say, this is how I prefer to be loved? You talk about love languages. Do you know yours? Can you say, this is how I prefer to be loved? And ask that person, make room for them. How do you want to be loved? I think all of these things, have to be established before having a partner. It's why the advice of like, enjoy your 20s, you spend that time navigating that and figuring out that question. So when you do enter a relationship super early, now you're navigating who you are alongside someone else. Right? And they're navigating themselves. And that journey is rocky. That journey takes patience because we're all trying to figure it out. But I think, the equally yoked thing, it's like, what does that mean? And how does someone support you through that? And the thing that I keep hearing like in everyone is like, childhood, right? Your childhood, your upbringing,
can't get away from it.
It's so important. And I didn't realize that, we both have 2-parent households. So I thought, oh, okay, check that.
Yep. On paper. Right. The grass is cut.
Right.
The house looks good from the outside.
I love that.
And even when you look at friendships, you think that. It's like, oh, she had 2 parents and, like, she has a sister. She understands sisterhood. No, it doesn't mean that.
Right.
We grew up very differently. Though we had 2 parents that were present, that loved us to the best of their abilities, we grew up in total different worlds. And we didn't realize that until we were like 5 years in. Like, your mama did what? She said what? Your daddy said what? We didn't know. So it's like the optics don't matter.
Yeah. And I feel like we're calling this love notes. Like, those are some like the notes that we need to like write to ourselves, right? And just this kind of like, partnered or not, and even in friendship and in community, because I think that's another piece too, right? So like how we desire to be loved by our community, like whoever you say is your tribe, whoever you say are your people, like there's disconnects between, sometimes we expect that our friends or, our tribe know what's important to us and don't. And so, you might be going into something really special and you're expecting like your group chat to blow up and everybody's like, that was today? And you're like, no, this was the thing where y'all was supposed to be like having my back. Right, like I've been watching Right. And so, even like in community, I think, and even like I understand why people say kind of get yourself together before your relationship, but I push back because it's an ongoing process regardless. And sometimes people have this really unhealthy metric that like you're single because you haven't figured yourself out and you're in a relationship because you have. And it's just not true. It's not true. And furthermore, in a healthy, long-standing relationship, both people are going to keep changing. And you have to keep getting to know that version of themselves. We've been together 15 years this year. There have been many versions of him and me that we've had to like evolve to and be like, oh, okay, this is important to you now. Okay, okay, that's still with you. Like you have to keep changing to learn the person and learn yourself. And so I think that a part of why, that kind of we're not with people in the dark times, a part of what's harmful is that once people like partner off, we kind of assume everything's all well and good until they get divorced or until they have some bad public argument or some scandal. And the reality is that like that's just a piece of an ongoing puzzle. But if we're not all like actively like talking to ourselves about what we need to love ourselves, to love each other, what we need from our community, et cetera, like it breaks down because it all takes intentionality, which is why I think therapy being more accepted is a good thing, because if nothing else, therapy keeps in front of you like what are your self-love goals, what are your community love, what are their goals for yourself.
You have to have goals. You have to have things that you want for yourself, that you want for your community, because if you don't have goals, I don't know what you're governing under, right? You have to have some level of, this is my standard for myself. I have a standard for myself, right? And I have goals that I need to meet personally and goals that I want to meet with other people within my community. But I think you have to be intentional about every day you wake up.
That's interesting. That from a self-standard perspective, at least jump in on this one. How have you helped guide people to develop those? Because when it comes to community, self, relationships, those are 3 different spectrums. But continuity is what we're talking about. Should be had. Continuity is tough as an adult.
Right.
How do you help people get there?
I think a big part of it is being vulnerable and coming out and being vulnerable. Like these are the struggles that I'm having. It's coming out like I have a history of X, Y, and Z, or like actually like the past couple years have been hit hard, or I'm having a really terrible day to day and I'm really anxious. It's being vulnerable and creating a culture of safe vulnerability where people can come authentically as themselves and be like, this is where I'm at right now and it's okay, but I have a community to set me up, to like back me up and everything like that. And so whether it is gathering women together and being vulnerable in a space and like just being like down with each other, or having people that we see as leaders come into those spaces and exemplify vulnerability and authenticity. I think it's creating a culture about it. And I think everyone has a role in it. You know, everyone's a different type of leader, but everyone has a responsibility to be vulnerable and bring vulnerability and authenticity in those spaces.
What would be your advice to people who want a community but don't have one? But they're adults, right? They're not like they're not in settings where they would naturally kind of just fall into a community, but they want one. Because I hear that a lot.
Because adults do not just walk up and say, "Hey, I'm Keenan, nice to meet you. I'd love to be friends." They just don't do that. Unfortunately, just be honest.
Right. No, it's...
So like what, or I don't know, best practices. I guess it could really be to anyone, but I'm curious about you because I know there's a lot of your work is like bringing people together.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting in that even though I'm a super outgoing person, like I'm like super outgoing and stuff like that, for a while, I felt very isolated and that I didn't have community. You know, so like I show up, I'm in the mix, but I'm low key, right? And so it's an interesting tension. I think a big part of it is your own psychology. And or my brother saying that, he's like, Elise, like, you're coming into those spaces expecting to be isolated, expecting not to foster community, expecting to be disappointed, and you manifest it, right? So you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna meet this person, like we're gonna chat for like the session or whatever like that, and then like dip bye, and that you give off that energy whether you sense it or not, and so forming community as an adult is hard.
It's hard,
but I think it is almost emitting an energy like I am welcoming any opportunity, and maybe this is not going to be like BFF for life, you know, but like we'll see where this goes,
right?
But demonstrating that vulnerability, that openness, and just fostering connections in that way organically. And I think if you're putting that energy out, people receive it. And if people are down, they're gonna be like, yeah, who's this girl Elise? She seems kind of cool. She has bold eyebrows, but we like her. But I think also it's just like seeing what's in your community, right? Like if you have a passion for rock climbing, go to Brooklyn Boulders. I don't know, I've never been there, but I know that's like, and like just start.
It's awesome.
Oh really? Okay.
I think
Brooklyn Boulders, not Brooklyn Bowl.
No, we should
Boulders.
go boulders.
Like rocks.
Let's do it.
I think one of the hardest part of vulnerability comes from seeking communities, and since that communities have guidelines. So like if you're being vulnerable and you're not going to line up with 100% of the community guidelines,
So you're ostracized.
but what part, you have that fear of being ostracized, you have that like, do I fit here? Or there's things that I see that I like most of it, but that part of the community rubs me the wrong way. So it's like, am I accepting of that when I jump into this community? Or like, what do I look like asking to be a part of a community where you see that it's not 100%,
Aligned,
but
Yeah.
I mean, it's close, it's better than what I've got.
Yeah.
So it's...
The downside is historically church has had those labels and has accepted that bifurcation within community.
I was going to say that, like, in terms of roles and even churches, you know, because in my 20s, my community was my church, right? It was like young adult community. We do everything together. There's like Bible study. Then there, you know, you're serving almost every day of the week in church, and so that automatically becomes your community. But then when you leave that community, you realize actually that wasn't my community. It was just people in the same space.
Yep.
And that's a difference because of there has to be some intentionality. There has to be, we're not just showing up in the same space and we're friends because we just happen to be in this space. You know, I think that's a big part of, like, you know, you've learned in high school and school and every other part of community before your 20s is like your friends are people who go to the same school or in the same space as you.
Yep.
So now
Exactly.
being in the 30s, it was like, oh wait, so my community is no longer just in my church, right? My actual community are the people around me who are intentional about keeping in touch, who are intentional about celebrating me, or who are intentional, like we're in the group chat together, and so my best friend lives in California, but we communicate every day because we're intentional about building that relationship and keeping that relationship. It's no longer just about the same space. But I had to get to this place though where I realized that, because when I entered into a new church community, I realized that I was seeking out kind of like high school, like, oh, who's the most popular person in this space, or who are the pastors, or I have to get to know them because that's, and I have to be a leader in this community because I've been a leader in every other community. And it's like, oh no, I don't, because this is the place where I worship, but my community is not necessarily just here. And so then I can take that weight off of that space, and people take that pressure off of them to be something more to me than they need to be.
Yeah, I've been on the opposite of that. Like, my wife tells me all the time that I'm like an alien for the fact that I've done so many community building things and still have very little to show for a community. Like the person that was like on marching band in high school, in the army where we went to a war with people, like HBCU, like Freemason. Like, I go to a lot of things where it brings in a lot of like-minded people, and I always tend to come out the other end still solo dolo. So it's like,
which is best.
And,
to be candid.
But you have to figure out, like, what part am I, like, what am I not showing to build the part that we talk about? Because me,
point.
a lot of times
And that's a real question that isn't always delivered to ourselves, from ourselves that nicely.
Right.
He's very pleasant.
I'm
Really?
Very pleasant.
like, but I had to, but her questioning of it had to make me look at it. It was like, where did all the people go? Like, it's almost like the money, right? Like, how did I spend that $20,000?
Where did all the people go? That's a note.
Where did? Oh, that's a no. We gonna write a love note.
That's a question that I like asked myself in my like early 20s. I was like, am I not a crew person?
Right.
Right. Like, it's like I was sorority
team.
girl. Right. I was sorority girl. I was like Black AFM. We like killed it at Yale. Like we were just like, I was always in these spaces. I'm like, but why don't I feel like I have a crew? Why don't I have a crew? Why don't I have like the 16 people to go to Cabo for spring break, or like do all this? And I think after a while, I was like, I'm okay. I was like, I don't need to be a crew. I don't need to have 30 people deep in a group text and
who threw you a surprise birthday party.
Right, but like feel validated.
I'm still waiting on my surprise. I want a surprise.
Me too.
Put in the atmosphere. I want a surprise. But it can't be this year because now I said it. It's got to be later.
Maybe you'll forget, and then you can be surprised.
I didn't say that.
Surprise birthday party.
A big part of it is not feeling like you need to be validated by having a solid crew.
Right.
Yeah.
It's that self-security and that self-love.
It's what we think the crew represents.
Right.
We
But
think
like,
the crew represents like you have all this love,
Quantity.
which doesn't always mean
That's the thing.
it doesn't always mean that either. Like sometimes there's all these like rogue individuals that are a crew,
This is more.
but they don't know each other as well.
So at this point in my life, I'm like, you know what? Like I have that like best friend in like Bumble, North Carolina. And
That's a real place?
But like, yeah, no, it's called Saxapaha.
Oh.
We'll get into that off tape. But it's just, I might have these disparate, like, random friends that may not be my like crew. They might not all know each other. We might not all have a group text. But I get more value and like life affirming joy, blessings, all that from my isolated 10 than a superficial 30. Based in New York who's going to brunch every Sunday.
Yep.
So,
But you have someone, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
You have to have some sense of community, some tribe, someone you trust. I think that's the isolation that's like unhealthy. When it's just you, and it's like you are the judge, the jury, you figure everything out by yourself. I think that is when it gets to be unhealthy. Personally, I have a council, very small council. When things come up, I have to take it to the council. I do.
I know, I'm like looking at Olivia Pope.
I love it. I love it.
It's just a handful of people you trust that love you, that believe in you, that know your vision, that cover you, that pray for you. But you have to have someone. And I think that's the question that I pose to him is like, who are your someones? Who's your counsel? It can't just be me. I can't be the only person. That's not community, and I don't want that for you. It needs to be people outside of just us. Like everyone needs a community. And I think brotherhood. I think when it comes to masculinity, and you're all men, you tell me. I feel like as a woman, I know I need a support group of women, and I feel like as a man, you need other men that you trust and that share your like-mindedness. You know.
Fair. I'll push back a little bit, and I'll say the isolation isn't always bad, because when it comes to you and your maker, it's just one-on-one, right? That time is critical. Granted, outside of that individual time with God, the crew is necessary, and I think size agnostic, someone else is critical. It can't just be you all the time. Isolation time, although a little contradictory, is also important.
I think it's important to distinguish between isolation and solitude.
Yeah.
Because it's possible to be alone and lonely.
There we go.
Right?
Yeah.
But you can be alone and have a deep sense of peace.
Yeah,
You can have room for people in the crowd and also feel alone. So I think solitude is important. I also think this move we're going into, a tribe, a crew, a squad, a community, all those related goals are important. And that's something I think I have come to appreciate more in my 30s. I have an excessive appreciation for solitude. I enjoy reading, I enjoy thinking, I enjoy writing, I enjoy editing. I enjoy editing what somebody else edited so we can edit more. But
Yes.
that's not the entirety of life, and there's something that can only sprout fully, right, when we're together in this kind of space of belonging and communion. So the points that are being shared around the table, the love note, right, maybe is to have a good sense of proportion between solitude and life-giving belonging, because there are some kinds of association that will drain you.
Yeah.
Right? There are some squads we got to divest from and pull back from. So I would just offer that as well. Sometimes we have to retreat from certain squads and reconnect with others.
And also, just to that point, I mean, you alluded to it, Yolanda, when you were like, when you left one community, you rebuilt. But I think it's also important to name that, like, people are people, and they sometimes will change on you. And sometimes, your council, somebody in your council will go rogue, or somebody who, used to be, like, down for you is no longer. And I think that's why the self-love piece, it really can't be separated from any of this. Because we, as great as, like, a crew and a squad are, my 30s have taught me that, like, that's great, but if you don't also have some sort of, like, you and God, you and yourself, if everybody leaves me, I'm okay. Then the crew and the squad and the council can become crutches, right? That, like, when they don't have your back, you can, go back into wondering if, like, if you're good enough and what have you. And, I think one thing that's really powerful about this kind of like self-love piece that Elise was talking about is, if you have that, you can kind of, I don't want to say reinvent yourself, but you can recreate the things you need if the things around you fall apart. So like a few years ago, I spent 3 months in England in a study abroad program, and I was there just because I was burned out by everything New York had to give me, and I was there by myself. Thankfully, Andrew was able to come once a month for a week, but for the most part, I was there by myself. And for the first few weeks, I didn't have any community, but I needed that, to your point. I needed to detach. I needed to not be anybody's pastor. Not anybody's. I was a president of an organization. Nobody's president. Nobody's, go-to person to fix conflict. I needed to not be anybody's anything. So I had, like, no labels. Nobody knew who I was. And for the first few weeks, that was great. Then I started craving community. And I met this a friend of mine who is now a friend, wasn't a friend then, but someone recommended her to me, and they had this black expat group, this group of like black Americans who lived in London, and they literally just have a WhatsApp, and this WhatsApp has like 200 something people in it, maybe more, of just like black folks who have moved to London. And what they do is they just drop whatever they're going to in the WhatsApp, right? Hey, we're going to a museum exhibit. We're going to this, we're going to that. It might be 2 people that show up. It might be 20 people. And what I started to do was I started to opt into the WhatsApp stuff when I needed community, and then I, come back out when I didn't. And I started to slowly rebuild like my identity, because I was able to your point at least, give off that I want to be here energy. And it was all well and good. And I came back into New York. And when I came back into New York, a lot of the things that were normative for me started to change. But like that inner ability to like be okay regardless was kind of formed while I was in England in ways that it hadn't been when I was over here. And it has kind of kept me from going under with all the change that has happened in my life over the past couple of years in every aspect, in job, friends, community, all of that. So, you know, I know we're kind of winding down, but I would just love to like end with just like, how do we prioritize that, like that love of God and love of self, you know, regardless of everyone else around us.
I think that question even more intentionally could sound like God's love is blank. Actually, if we could wrap up with that piece. We talked about self-love. We talked about efficacy. We talked about isolation. We talked about relationship and partnership. But what does it actually mean to each of us when we say God's love is? Anyone can start. I'll start off. So I'll say that in my times of solitude, in my growth within community and interpersonal development, I've learned that God's love is grace to the highest form. There's zero stickiness. There's zero, you will always be X. Anything and everything done can be moved forward from, and nothing has to be lived in that's old and toxic. So for me, God's love is the ultimate form of grace, such that it's taught me how to give it to myself.
And to piggyback off of that, because the word that kept coming up was agape, this unconditional love, right? That it is grace. It is that I can mess up a million times. I can be my most authentic self with God, and He still loves me. He still chooses me. I'm chosen, and all of those things. And because of that God love that informs my self-love.
I think for me, God's love is a kanos love and not a neos love. So kanos, like if you're thinking about the idea of new. So it's not like if you have a pair of tennis shoes, you just get the same pair of tennis shoes. It's like, no, you get a rocket ship. Like it's like so other dimension of life affirming, life giving, blessings, love. So it is something that can't even be compared to what you have now. So it's a kanos love and not a neos love.
I would say God's love is time, because with time you can do all the things we're talking about, and you don't have to wake up in the morning or even make it back to your bed. So God's love is the time, which is, we should talk about it like money. You can spend time, save time, give time. Just everything that you would say you give money for, just replace it with time, and that's God's love.
God's love is permanent. I think that, you know, people will change on you, and so it's comforting to know that God is permanent. God's love is permanent.
I think the thing that comforts me about God's love is like an infinite amount of trust. I think the trust for me, and like good times, bad times, whatever time there is, like that knowing, that same sense of, like you've mentioned, like knowing you're going to be okay, or like everyone can go away and you're going to be fine. I think for me, like I've found that in that level of trust, when you think I don't have the answers, I know that trust is infinite, and I can always lean on it.
Pastor?
This is all heavy. Grace, time. I'm leaning on what Pastor Gabby was saying about God's love being permanent. Two words that come to me are first, laughter. When I think of God's love, I think of the ability to embrace the ironies of my own life. Things that I thought might have gone a certain way in school but turned out another way, and yet, still was able to learn and have really great moments of epiphany. And so laughter, levity, irony is one aspect. I think God's love gives us the ability to always take different perspectives on our own life story, on our history as people. We've seen so much injustice, and yet, you know, we have spirituals, we have Toni Morrison, we have James Baldwin, we have, you know, so we could go on Alice Walker, Ralph Ellison, so all of this richness coming out of horror in some ways. And then I also think God's love is just. I think a loving God who is not also just is unworthy of our time, unworthy of worship. But because God is both of those things, loving and just and fair, it calls, I think, all of us. I certainly feel, I don't know, a nagging sense. I don't want to say nagging. That's not the word I'm looking for. A constant urging, maybe that's the word, to do justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with God, which is, I think, kind of like a life Bible verse for me in Micah 6:8. So.
Understood. I think this dynamic approach to talking about love has been exceptional. I just want to thank all of you for being here today. This conversation has been so rich. I can't wait to get the tape. Please let me know. I don't think we do tapes anymore.
Black folks call everything.
Black church is always a tape.
Mama, grandma, what was the tape you used to listen to and put it on the little record back in the day? It's all tape.
So with that said,
Yeah.
I can't wait to see this.
I'm with you.
But for the first DLE Love Notes, the roundtable, I just want to say thank you for your time, and for everyone that's watching and listening, we will see you again soon. Thank you all.
Thank you, Keenan.
No problem.
We appreciate you.